You're stretched out in bed, phone in one hand, blanket tugged up with the other. Somewhere in your skull, a voice is yelling at you, "Go to sleep. Tomorrow's a work day." But your thumb isn't listening. It's operating independently. It just keeps flicking upward. 3 hours pass, and you finally look up to realize you've just crammed your skull full of deeply essential knowledge. Things like why otters link paws while napping so the current doesn't carry them off in their sleep. The saga of two strangers online, whose entire relationship imploded over a laser tag argument, and grainy footage of a man somewhere in a rainforest hand digging an entire swimming pool with nothing but a shovel at 2 in the morning. We modern humans have, genuinely and thoroughly, mastered the art of wrecking our own rest. But wind the clock back 30,000 years, and the situation gets considerably grimmer. Once the sun dropped, our ancestors weren't lying there stewing over some stranger's online meltdown. They were occupied with the more pressing task of not becoming a leopard's late night meal. So, what did ancient humans really do once darkness fell? Because after sundown in the Stone Age, life turned into something close to a straight horror film. In pure biological terms, we are almost laughably unequipped for darkness, and it's worth sitting with that for a second. Our night vision is genuinely poor compared to most nocturnal predators. We carry no claws, no fangs, no thick protective hide, and we're not remotely fast on our feet next to anything actually hunting us. Drop a Homo sapiens into a black forest 40,000 years ago, and you basically had a nervous, hairless snack wandering around waiting to be found. And that darkness bore no resemblance to a modern city's version of dark. No street lamps existed, no glow leaking from a neighbor's window. It was truly absolute black. The sort of dark where raising a hand in front of your own face gives you no proof it's still attached. Somewhere in that blackness moved wolves, hyenas, cave lions, and possibly a hostile neighboring group. This isn't just an atmospheric guess either. South African paleoanthropologist C.K. Brain spent years examining fossil bones from caves at Swartkrans and Sterkfontein and found puncture marks in early hominin skulls that matched almost exactly the spacing of leopard canine teeth, evidence that our distant ancestors were regularly hunted, not simply hunting, long before they figured out how to reliably fight back. So before anyone in the group dared shut their eyes for the night, they needed some kind of real, working defense already in place. And, somewhat surprisingly, it wasn't a sharpened spear that ended up doing the heaviest lifting. It was fire. Exactly when humans first mastered it in a reliable, everyday way is still debated among archaeologists. Sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa show possible ash and burned bone dating back close to 1 million years, though evidence that early is contested and far from unanimous among specialists. What's much less controversial is that by roughly 300 to 400,000 years ago, at sites like Kesem Cave in Israel, excavated by archaeologists Ron Barkai and Avi Gopher of Tel Aviv University, controlled fire had become a routine, daily fixture of human life, not an occasional accident, with a central hearth that shows signs of repeated use for cooking meat and gathering as a group. And fire wasn't just for cooking. It doubled as a flashlight, a heater, an insect deterrent, a security barrier against predators, and, oddly enough, something close to free therapy. There's a real reason you can stare into a campfire for an hour without getting bored. Research on fire gazing, including a study led by anthropologist Christopher Lynn at the University of Alabama, found that watching a fire measurably lowers blood pressure and produces a relaxed state similar to meditation, an effect that grew stronger the longer people watched. Your nervous system spent hundreds of thousands of years learning one simple rule: flames mean safety, so we haven't died yet. Here's the part that changes everything, though. Fire didn't just keep predators away from the group. It effectively added extra hours onto the human day that had never existed before. Before controlled fire, sunset meant your working day was simply finished, full stop, whether or not the tasks were done. Daylight hours were consumed almost entirely by the business of staying alive, hunting, foraging, repairing tools, tending children, leaving essentially no spare mental bandwidth for anything beyond immediate survival. Only once a fire was reliably burning, pushing back the darkness and the predators hiding inside it, did people finally get consistent spare time each evening to sit still and do the impractical, seemingly useless, uniquely human things. Think, imagine, gossip, and tell stories to each other. If a single controlled flame managed to rewire the entire rhythm of human evolution, stick around, because the rest of this story gets even stranger from here. And if you like this kind of dig into the hidden logic behind perfectly ordinary things, go ahead and subscribe now before you forget. A number of anthropologists now argue that complex language and shared culture weren't primarily forged out on the hunt, but around these nightly gossip circles. That's not just a comfortable, convenient guess dressed up as science. Anthropologist Polly Weissner spent decades recording conversations among the Juhoanzi San people of the Kalahari and published a striking 2014 study comparing daytime talk to nighttime talk around the fire. During daylight hours, conversations skewed heavily toward economic matters, complaints, and social friction. Roughly a third of it, by her count, focused on criticizing or gossiping about others. After dark, once the fire was lit, that pattern flipped almost completely. Firelit conversations shifted overwhelmingly towards storytelling, myths, and songs. And Weissner argued that this nightly shift likely stretches back deep into human evolutionary history, since firelight suppresses the urge to bicker over resources and opens space for imagination instead. Campfire storytelling functioned as the original entertainment platform, part news feed, part streaming service, part encyclopedia. Being a skilled storyteller carried real social weight in these communities, sometimes raising a person's standing within the group more reliably than raw hunting skill alone ever could, since a good storyteller kept the whole group entertained, informed, and bonded night after night. Content creation, in other words, might genuinely be one of humanity's oldest professions, minus the clickbait thumbnail and the algorithm, replaced by something closer to you, will not believe what I ran into out there today. Those nighttime stories weren't idle entertainment either. Some of them appear to have carried genuinely useful, practical information across staggering stretches of time. Geographer Patrick Nunn and linguist Nicholas Reed published research in 2016 examining Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, describing coastlines that no longer exist, landmasses now submerged offshore. And they concluded some of these stories likely preserve accurate memory of sea level rise that occurred more than 7,000 years ago, passed down purely through spoken narrative for hundreds of generations without writing. A story told around a fire wasn't just a way to pass a dark, dangerous evening safely. In some rigorously documented cases, it functioned as an actual, working data storage system, outlasting any single human lifetime by a margin that most modern hard drives, servers, or backup systems genuinely can't yet match. But what happened once people actually settled in to sleep? It's tempting to picture someone just collapsing onto bare, cold ground and hoping for the best. In reality, ancient bedding was remarkably engineered, and it's some of the oldest direct evidence we have of humans deliberately designing an object for comfort and health rather than pure survival. At Sibutu Rock Shelter in South Africa, archaeologist Lynn Wadley and colleagues at the University of the Witwatersrand published research in the journal Science documenting layered plant bedding dated to roughly 77,000 years ago, with evidence that people returned to the same shelter and rebuilt fresh bedding again and again across thousands of years of continuous use. The base layer was made of ash, spread thickly across the sleeping area, which insulated sleepers from cold stone, discouraged crawling insects from approaching, and helped control parasites living in the soil beneath. On top came a cushioning layer of soft sedge and rush stems, laid thick enough to soften the rock floor beneath. And the final layer used leaves from a specific local plant, Cryptocarya woody, chosen deliberately, researchers concluded, because it contains natural chemical compounds that repel and kill insects on contact. Essentially an organic bug net woven directly into the mattress itself, centuries before anyone understood the chemistry behind why it worked. People 77,000 years ago were building insect-resistant bedding from scratch, layer by layer, while modern humans in 2026 still lose regular skirmishes against mosquitoes, despite entire supermarket aisles devoted to chemical spray. These early sleepers were also fastidious about hygiene in their own particular way. Rather than washing bedding the way we do laundry today, the archaeological evidence, specifically repeated ash layers sandwiched between fresh plant material, suggests they periodically burned old bedding outright to destroy accumulated bacteria, parasites, and pests, then rebuilt from scratch with clean material. a fairly extreme but genuinely effective form of Stone Age deep cleaning that modern hygiene routines still essentially mimic in spirit, minus the open flame. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because the popular claim about how ancient humans actually slept turns out to be shakier than most people assume. You've probably heard the version that says, before artificial lighting, humans universally slept in two separate blocks each night, dropping off shortly after dusk, waking naturally in the middle of the night for an hour or two of quiet activity, talking, praying, tending the fire, or other private business, before drifting into a second sleep phase until dawn. That idea traces back largely to historian Roger E. Kirk of Virginia Tech, who spent more than 15 years combing through diaries, court depositions, medical texts, and literary references from medieval and early modern Europe for his book At Day's Close, published in 2005. He turned up more than 500 separate references to what people at the time simply called their first sleep and their second sleep, treated as such an unremarkable, everyday fact of life that writers rarely bothered explaining what they meant. It's genuinely well documented history, at least for agrarian, pre industrial European societies, stretching back several centuries. The complication is that this specific evidence comes from written records a few hundred years old, not from the deep Paleolithic past 30 or 40,000 years back, and it's easy to blur those two very different timescales together when the story gets simplified for a headline. When sleep researchers actually went looking for segmented sleep among modern hunter gatherer societies, people living right now without electricity, alarm clocks, or industrial schedules, arguably our closest living approximation of ancestral conditions, they found something that complicates the tidy version of this story considerably. In 2015, neuroscientist Jerome Siegel at UCLA led a study published in the journal Current Biology that fitted roughly 94 individuals across three pre-industrial societies: the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, with wrist activity monitors to track their sleep continuously for weeks at a time. None of these groups slept in two distinct nightly blocks. Instead, they typically stayed awake for several hours after sunset, often gathered around a fire, talking exactly the way Wiesner's Juhoency recordings described, before finally lying down for the night, sleeping in one consolidated stretch, averaging around 6.5 to 7 hours with unusually high sleep efficiency, close to 86% by Siegel's measurements, then waking up before sunrise with almost no evidence of a structured segmented pattern and very little regular daytime napping either, despite living in conditions closer to ancestral than almost anyone else studied. So the honest answer is that segmented two-phase sleep does appear to be a real, well-documented pattern in parts of pre-industrial European history. But whether it reflects some universal, hardwired ancestral default stretching back to the Stone Age remains genuinely unresolved among researchers, and some of the best currently available evidence actually argues against treating it as a fixed human universal. Either way, the deeper point still holds up. Rigid, forced 8-hour sleep blocks, bookended by a screaming alarm clock, are a distinctly modern invention, not a fixed law written into human biology, and different human groups across history and geography have organized their nights in noticeably different ways depending on climate, safety, and daily demands. What hasn't changed nearly as much is the wiring underneath all of it. Your body now lives inside a Wi-Fi connected apartment, but your nervous system is still running software built for a much older, far more dangerous environment, and it hasn't gotten the update memo. There's a reason rain sounds on a phone app can lull you to sleep almost instantly. In an ancestral environment, steady rainfall masked the sound of your own movement and often meant predators had a harder time tracking prey by scent and sound alike. So your nervous system learned, over an enormous span of generations, to file that particular noise under safe rather than alarming. There's a reason sleeping beside another person can feel measurably more secure than sleeping utterly alone in total silence. Since a resting group meant more eyes and ears collectively watching for danger, a very old form of safety in numbers that still shows up in how quickly people relax around a familiar sleeping partner. And there's a very real, well-understood biological reason a glowing phone screen at midnight makes it harder to fall asleep. Specialized cells in the retina, discovered in the early 2000s and containing a light-sensitive pigment called melanopsin, respond specifically to blue wavelengths of light and signal directly to the brain's internal clock, a region called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Blue light hitting those cells suppresses melatonin production and tells your body, quite convincingly, that daylight has just arrived, regardless of what the actual sky outside your window is doing at that moment. Modern researchers studying this pathway have found that even relatively dim screen light, held close to the eyes for an hour or more before bed, can meaningfully delay the onset of natural sleepiness, which is precisely the mechanism behind that familiar experience of feeling wide awake at midnight despite genuine exhaustion. Temperature works against modern sleepers in a similar, quieter way. Human core body temperature naturally needs to drop by a degree or two to properly trigger sleep onset, something that happened automatically once the sun went down in an open, unheated ancestral environment. A modern bedroom sealed against drafts and kept at a comfortable, climate-controlled temperature all night can blunt that natural cooling cue considerably, which is part of why a slightly cooler room so reliably helps people fall asleep faster even now. There's another ancient rhythm hiding in plain sight that almost nobody thinks about anymore: the moon. In 2017, biologist Horacio de la Iglesia at the University of Washington tracked sleep patterns among Toba and Calm communities in northern Argentina, comparing a group with no electricity, one with limited access, and one fully connected to the modern grid, and found that people in all three groups, including those with full access to electricity and screens, went to bed later and slept measurably less in the nights leading up to a full moon, then gradually shifted back to earlier bedtimes as the moon waned toward darkness again. The effect was strongest in the community with no electricity at all. Roughly 90 minutes of shifted bedtime across the lunar cycle, but it was still clearly measurable, even among people living with electric lights and phones in their pockets. That suggests moonlight once functioned as a subtle, ancient extension of the campfire, an extra free source of usable light that nudged our ancestors towards staying active a little later during the brightest nights of each month, a rhythm apparently wired deeply enough into human biology that even a century of artificial lighting hasn't managed to fully erase it. And then there are dreams. Picture living 40,000 years ago. Every single night you vanish for several hours, and in that time, dead relatives reappear as though nothing had happened. Monsters give chase through landscapes that shift under your feet, and you wander through places that don't exist anywhere in the waking world. Then you resurface with no neuroscience, no psychology, absolutely no framework whatsoever to explain what just happened inside your own skull. It makes complete sense that so many ancient and traditional cultures treated dreams as literal visits to another realm, since for them, the boundary separating dream from reality simply wasn't drawn the way it is today. The 19th century anthropologist Edward Burnett Tylor went so far as to argue that dreaming itself may have been the original spark behind the human concept of a soul, reasoning that early people, encountering deceased relatives or watching their own bodies act independently in dreams while their physical self lay motionless nearby, concluded that some separate spiritual self must exist beyond the physical body. Whether or not that specific theory holds up fully, and modern anthropologists generally treat it as one plausible thread among several rather than a settled, proven fact, it captures something real about how seriously dreams were once taken. They weren't dismissed as meaningless mental static, the way many people casually treat them today. They were treated as genuine information, worth interpreting, worth discussing, sometimes worth building an entire cosmology around. Among a number of hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, including groups across southern Africa, the natural period of nighttime wakefulness wasn't treated as wasted, unproductive time at all. It was often used for shared storytelling, ritual, communal singing, or even trance-based healing practices, treated as a normal, even valuable, part of the night rather than a malfunction requiring a fix. There's a genuine irony sitting at the center of all this. Our ancestors lived surrounded by constant, real, physical danger. No hospitals down the road, no locks on the door, no climate control, no memory foam, mattresses cushioning every joint. And yet, by most of the available evidence, they generally slept when their bodies signaled it was time, and woke when their bodies signaled that too, staying reasonably synced with the actual rhythm of their environment: the sun, the moon, the temperature, the sounds moving around the perimeter of the fire. We, meanwhile, are almost certainly the safest, most physically comfortable population of humans that has ever existed on this planet, protected by walls, alarms, and doors that lock from the inside, sleeping on engineered mattresses in temperature controlled rooms. And yet, here we are most nights, staring at the ceiling well past midnight, wide awake and exhausted at the same time, scrolling through the relationship drama of a total stranger we will never meet, while a nervous system built to listen for cave lions, circling a fire tries to figure out what to do with a glowing notification instead. So, what did ancient humans really do at night? They defended themselves and their group with fire long before they had any other reliable protection against the dark and everything moving inside it. And that same fire quietly bought them the first spare hours in human history to sit still, think, talk, and tell stories. Hours that researchers like Polly Weissner and the deep time evidence gathered by Patrick Nunn now suggest helped build the foundations of language, myth, and shared culture itself, one fireside conversation at a time. They engineered genuinely sophisticated, insect resistant bedding, layered ash, soft reeds, and chemically protective leaves tens of thousands of years before modern pest control existed, and periodically burned the whole thing and started fresh, rather than simply airing it out the way we do laundry today. Their sleep patterns weren't identical across every era, culture, and environment, contrary to the tidy one size fits all story that tends to circulate online. And the honest, current evidence, from Eckert's European archives to Siegel's modern hunter gatherer data to De La Iglesia's lunar research, suggests our own biology is flexible enough to support more than one natural rhythm rather than being locked permanently into a single ancient template. And their dreams, unexplained and completely untethered from any scientific framework, still manage to shape entire belief systems. Maybe even the very concept of a soul, about what happens once the body goes still and the mind keeps moving without it. Strip away the phone, the street lamp, and the locked front door, and the actual core of the night hasn't changed nearly as much as it might first seem. It's still built around finding some reliable source of light, some genuine sense of safety, and some story worth telling before your eyes finally close for good.